Hello! We are a few weeks away from 2021, and with a new year means a fresh start and a new bullet journal. This year I decided to go with a 160 GSM journal by Maisie to give me the freedom to incorporate more watercolor into my spreads. As I go through the setup, I'll be reviewing the notebook, but from the get-go, I can tell you that I'm really loving it. If you're interested in checking out this notebook, you can find a link in the description and you can use the code RebeccaWho15 to get 15% off your purchase at checkout. They're a small business, and I'm definitely impressed with the quality so far. For 2020, I did a very simple minimalistic setup at the beginning of the year, but for this year, I wanted to go with something that was still pretty simple but added a little more color into my journal. You'll see throughout the setup that I actually only used a set of Sakura Pigma microns and some watercolors by Kuretake. I initially was planning on using markers to color my spread, but I wanted to get that softer, more neutral and muted look that comes from using watercolors. Plus, I couldn't wait to see how watercolors would work with the pages in this journal. Jumping right in, on the inside of the front cover, I made a key to reference throughout the year. It's the same system that I used this past year, but it worked well for me, so I'm going to keep using it for the next year. I used a script font to write out the header and then wrote out the symbols and the descriptions next to them. Looking back, the one thing that I would probably do differently on this setup would be to write the descriptions of the symbols in an all uppercase font to be more consistent with the rest of the setup, but that's just a minor detail, and I really love how the key turned out. To the right of the key, I decided that I wanted to draw something relatively simple, but that would still go well with the softness of the watercolors. I ended up choosing flowers, which honestly, I had no clue how to draw many flowers before this setup, but I actually learned how to draw this sort of cartoon rose from a tutorial by Shada Campbell here on YouTube. She does a lot of really cool plant doodles and watercoloring, and she definitely inspired me to incorporate flowers into my setup. As I mentioned before, I chose the Maisie journal because of the capability it has for handling watercolors. Since I drew the key on the inside cover, I wasn't super worried about the paper buckling, and it was the perfect page to start watercoloring on. So I chose a really light pink for the color of the rose, and then a light green for the leaves. I actually wanted a close-up shot of the drawing and painting on this page, but I lost all of that footage from a memory card error. I'm really lucky that I still had the footage from the overhead camera, but it was at this point that I realized that there was an error on the card, so let's zoom in now. I added a bit more green pigment to the leaves where they were attached to the stem of the flower and blended it outwards as I moved towards the tip of the leaf. I didn't have any issues with the watercolor on the inside cover, but I was still trying to minimize the amount of water that I used when putting it on my journal. Next, I wanted to incorporate my theme into the name page. Something that is really cute about this journal is that instead of just saying something like, "Please return this journal to," it actually says, "This journal is loved by." It just makes the journal feel more personal. When I first started planning this theme, this was the page that sparked the idea to incorporate floral designs throughout my setup because I really wanted to draw some sort of wreath around where I'd write my name. Since the other page with the key was fairly simple, I decided to draw a smaller version of the rose from the previous page and then just drew a circle. I am a little confused by this page because it feels a little bit different in texture from the other pages of this journal. Like, it's not quite as smooth. Maybe I'm just going crazy, but it felt slightly different. I used a little too much water and worked the paper a little too much while trying to shade with the watercolors. I don't think most people would paint on this first page anyway, but yeah, if you have this notebook and we're planning on watercoloring on this page, just try to minimize the amount of water that you use. I didn't really have a problem on the rest of the pages with the watercolor. After working on this page though, I decided that I would use the watercolors more for coloring in my drawing rather than actually painting with them. In the future, I want to do more with watercoloring, but I decided to just focus on using minimal water throughout the rest of this setup to minimize page buckling and bleeding. I think as I get more comfortable with this journal, I'll be able to do more with watercolors. Moving on, I always like to incorporate something that I can reflect on throughout the year. I wanted a quote or verse that would encourage me by reminding me that everything happens for a reason. 2020 was obviously a crazy year for many of us where a lot of our plans got turned upside down, so I wanted to have a page that would bring me peace of mind despite whatever might happen next year. I decided to go with the verse from Ecclesiastes 3:1, which says, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven." This verse is encouraging to me that I can wait on God's timing and that I can continue to put my hope in Him. The design for this verse actually came from a simple Google image of the verse, which I tried my best to copy. Then I drew different floral designs along the top left and the bottom right of the lettering. I used the same design for both of them, starting with the rose I drew on the last couple of pages. After, I started to incorporate this new flower, which kind of reminds me of the cherry blossoms that I drew for my Mulan-inspired setup in March. It was pretty much a 5-petal flower with some dots in the middle. I think the key to these flowers is just holding the pen very loosely and letting the pen glide over the page. The next flowers I added were these little lavender-like flowers, which started with a line following the curve and then just tiny hearts down the line. In the empty space, I filled in leaves around the rest of the curve. With the watercolors, I used a light pink for the rose and then a darker pink for the cherry blossom-like flower. Then I used a light purple for the lavender and green for the leaves. As mentioned earlier, I tried to minimize the amount of water that I used when painting to prevent bleeding and buckling. To minimize the water, I would touch the paintbrush to a paper towel to remove the excess water before painting directly on the paper. I don't know if I will ever do a wet-on-wet technique in this journal because I don't really like when paper buckles, but right after I finished this setup, I placed my journal underneath a stack of paper to make sure that all of the pages dried flat. And after that, I didn't see any wrinkles in the paper, so I would call this a success. Starting on my cover page, I wrote out 2021 in a script font and then started on my floral wreath. I wanted to incorporate all of the floral designs that I used on the previous pages and then also added some additional ones to fill the space. I started with a giant rose in the center at the bottom of the wreath, and then I tried my best to make both sides of the wreath somewhat symmetrical, starting with some leaves behind the rose and along the curve of the wreath. I drew some lavender and tiny leaves branching off of the wreath before drawing the cherry blossom flowers, some more lavender, leaves, and then this new style of leaf at the top of the wreath. The leaves for this one were pretty much just oval shaped, and then I connected all of them with lines. When I started painting it, I pretty much used all of the same colors from the previous pages, but I did add a different shade of green for some of the leaves and then painted the more circular leaf branch a shade of blue. I mentioned earlier that I'd be using an all uppercase font for part of the setup, and here I used it to write out the title. I tried to keep the letters all approximately the same width and height, and then I drew a line underneath to make a divider. I ended up drawing it the same way I drew the lavender, but then I ended up painting them green so that they were more like leaves. Maybe that's inconsistent, but I like how it turned out, and it just felt very clean to me. I started writing out the days of the month just using my normal pen and trying to keep the name of the month centered above the calendar. Now I just want to take a small pause to show you all, but I actually tend to write more at a diagonal rather than straight on. In the past, I always tried to keep my journal straight for the overhead camera, but I think I'm going to try to do what is more comfortable for me when filming, and hopefully my handwriting will look more neat than what it was in past videos. We'll see what I end up doing in the future. To finish off the first page of my future log, I decided to draw lines to divide up the sections of the months, and that was it. And now you get to see me do it again, or you can feel free to jump ahead. I actually really liked splitting up the future log across 4 pages because I could divide the year into quarters. Splitting the future log like this might be more helpful for people who are in school, but I think it helps me to divide up the year better. Then I'm able to organize what events are happening each month and to look ahead at the upcoming months more easily. A tip that I have for bullet journaling is to just take your time. I especially find this useful when I'm writing out the days of the month. I usually always try to check the calendar on my phone before writing the dates down in my journal to try to minimize the number of mistakes that I make, but hey, we all make mistakes sometimes, and that's okay. For the future log, I decided to leave the area to the right of the months blank where I'll be adding big events like birthdays and holidays, or just in general things that I'm looking forward to. But honestly, with 2021, I'm not really sure what to expect, so I think that the majority of the dates here will just be birthdays. I know some bullet journalers swear to never use rulers, but I decided to use a ruler here just to get that crisp line. And that's all for the future log. I like how simple and minimalistic it is. For my goals page, I started with just writing goals across the middle of the page. I chose to keep the same spreads that I did last year in my 2020 bullet journal setup, but I decided that I wanted to minimize the number of goals that I had for this year. Last year I wasn't able to focus on completing my goals because I was overwhelmed having 8 different categories with multiple goals in each category. I'm still deciding what goals I want to have for this upcoming year, but I think that one of the ones I really want to focus on is learning Chinese. It's something that I've been meaning to do for a while, but I've never been super active with trying to learn. So you all can keep me accountable now. For this page, I drew overlapping circles with one per goal that I want to focus on. I'm going to write the overarching goal at the top and then have mini goals that I can work towards to get me there. For example, learning Chinese would be a main goal, and then some of the mini goals that I can do to get me there include learning all of the radicals and studying 5 Chinese characters a day as often as I can. 5 definitely may seem small, but if I did that every day, I'd be able to learn over 1,800 characters. Even if you're unsure about goals you have, I still think it's important to set goals that you can work towards. I went on ahead and drew roses in both corners of the page and then started watercoloring them. I wanted to zoom back in when I watercolored this leaf to just show you all the amount of water that I was able to use on the page. As you can see, the water absorbed really quickly and I didn't really go back over anywhere that I painted, but I'm really loving the super soft colors of the watercolor. The next page is more relevant to me as I made a YouTube page to keep track of what footage I have and which videos I have in the video editing process. If this isn't something that you need, then you can always convert this page to track books you'd like to read or anything else you can think of. After writing the title and drawing the rose on the spread, I decided to make a simple border around the page and painted the rose. This was really quick and easy, and I think it's always good to have a mix of simple spreads among more complex spreads. People often believe that you have to be artistic to be able to bullet journal well, but the bullet journaling system is really just a system to help you be the most productive that you can be. I personally just like to add more of an artistic aspect to allow my bullet journal to be a creative outlet. It's also just really fun to do something creative every so often because it makes you more imaginative and it makes you think outside of the box. One of the spreads that I ran out of room on in my last journal was the one where I tracked all of the songs that I loved in 2020. Part of the reason that happened was because I wrote out each song title rather than entire album names. So to make more room, I simply wrote playlist and drew a simple headphone doodle in the middle of the page. The headphones were super simple to draw, it was just 2 ovals connected by an upside down U. The ovals were a little skinnier when they were connected to the rest of the headphones. I also made the line at the top a little thicker. At this point, I was a little impatient and the ink from the Micron hadn't really dried before I started erasing, so I accidentally dragged some of the ink across the page. I also didn't know how to incorporate flowers in the spread, so I actually just used the purple and pink colors from the previous pages and just made a splash of color behind the headphones. I think throughout this year, I'm just going to start at the top of the page and write the song titles from left to right as I find ones that I like. If you want to see how the spread ends up getting filled out, as always, you can follow me on my socials. The last spread in the setup is my list of everything that I want to watch. I absolutely love watching Asian dramas, so I always like to keep track of ones that look interesting to me. If you've watched any dramas or shows in general that you enjoy, please drop them in the comments below so that I can find new recommendations. I ended up drawing a little film reel in the bottom right corner of the page and I really like how it turned out. It was also very simple to draw because it was just made up of a bunch of circles. I started drawing a bigger circle with a tiny one in the center, and then I just drew 5 smaller ones going around the tiny center circle. Similar to the YouTube spread, I decided to draw a border around this page, and then to match the playlist page, I just watercolored blue and green behind the film reel. It feels a little anticlimactic that I didn't draw any flowers on these last 2 pages, but I wanted something simple that left me a lot of space for all of the recommendations. And now for the final flip through of my 2021 bullet journal setup. The setup was a very relaxing process for me, and even though it had more of an artistic aspect, it was still pretty simple overall. I was really impressed using the watercolors in the Maisie Lane journal, and the soft colors of the flowers made me really happy. I hope you're looking forward to the new year just as much as I am. If you decide to recreate any part of the spread, then tag me in your recreations on Instagram, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye!